Hi Management 4300 students, this is Steve Wagner, and this is a short lecture on the use of work stoppages in disputes between unions and businesses. There's different ways that unions and businesses can use economic pressure to deal with an impasse. Again, at some point, the union and the business may just feel like they can't come to an agreement, and that there needs to be some economic pressure brought to bear. From the union perspective, the classic example is the strike. And there can be different reasons for unions to have a strike. It could be a purely economic strike saying we're not being paid enough or we're paying too much for our health care. It could be an unfair labor practice strike. It could be the union saying that the business is not bargaining in good faith, for example, and therefore committing an unfair labor practice. There may be sympathy strikes where one bargaining unit stops working in sympathy for another bargaining unit. There are examples of illegal strikes also. The classic example is the wildcat strike. Now, in a wildcat strike, workers stop working even though there is an active collective bargaining agreement. And in any collective bargaining agreement, there is a no strike clause. And so a wildcat strike is a violation of a legitimate work contract and therefore illegal. Sometimes it is the whole bargaining unit that goes out. Sometimes it is a part of that bargaining unit. Sometimes there are strikes that are jurisdictional in nature, a dispute between who should be represented in the bargaining unit. And that is illegal because that is something that is determined by the National Labor Relations Board. And it's not something that can be determined through an economic strike or through a work stoppage. Now, there are other ways that unions can bring economic pressure. One is a work slowdown. This is sometimes referred to as work to rule. In this case, the workers stay on the job, but they only do enough work to fulfill the very basic aspects of their job description. And in fact, it's kind of a form of passive aggressive where, they work so slowly and make things go so slowly that the organization becomes dysfunctional. Another type of economic pressure is a boycott, where they organize a consumer protest against either the business that they work for, that's their primary employer, or there might also be boycotts against subsidiaries or related businesses to the business that they are trying to put economic pressure on. Now, just as a union can go on strike, a primary employer can decide to lock out employees. They can say, hey, we can't agree to terms here, and so we don't need your services. We're going to lock you out and only use non-union personnel until you agree to our terms. And so that could include the use of temporary replacement workers. And primary employers can also react by using replacement workers when a union goes on strike. And so if a union goes on strike, the business can hire replacement workers, which may or may not be permanent. That largely is determined based on the reason for the strike, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So this is historical data on work stoppages over the last 70 years almost. It doesn't quite go up to current times, but it's pretty close. And one thing to take note of here is, how the number of strikes per year in the United States has steeply declined. Again, remember that 1947, this is right after World War II. There's a lot of union power, and this is around the time where there was the Taft-Hartley Act reforms that started stripping away some of that power from the unions in the labor law. And so part of that, again, of that legislation was motivated by the number of strikes and the amount of time that work was being idle in our country. And we can see that there has been a steep decline. And now, strikes are fairly rare. Although I would be interested to see what the data has been in the last 4 years, because I think, at least from my sense of the news, I think there may have been an increase over the last 4 years in the number of strikes, but nothing to approach what we saw in the 1940s and the 1950s and even up in through the 1970s. So why do work stoppages happen? What makes them more likely to happen? So strikes are more likely when the preceding contract was longer in duration. And so employees might feel the need to strike because they've been working under what they consider a bad contract over a long period of time. It might prime them to go on strike. Negotiations, when they are used in this pattern bargaining sense, may be more likely to result in strikes. And so again, it might be a union trying to make gains across different companies might use strikes as a way of making those gains. When bargaining units are larger, strikes are more likely. Again, a larger bargaining unit has more leverage. They're more likely to be able to put more economic pressure on that business and might feel that a strike actually will be effective. When there's sharp increases or decreases in earnings or lots of variation in financial performance, we see strikes are more likely. When there are safety concerns within a firm or an industry, we see strikes are more likely. So strikes are less likely when there are a few issues being negotiated, when firms employ a larger proportion of women. So by inference, women are less likely to vote to go on strike. And when there are higher wages than other firms or industries, strikes are less likely.